Good evening, everyone. Wonderful to see your faces here and to welcome you to what promises to be an extraordinary evening here at Washington National Cathedral. My name is Mary Ann Buddy, Bishop of the Diocese of Washington. Very pleased to, on behalf of all of us, to welcome Ruby Sales with us as our speaker. Or our conversation partner with Dean Hall. We are here tonight to reflect upon the legacy of Jonathan Daniels with his good friend, Ruby Sales. Let me just tell you a bit about this wonderful woman as a public theologian, historian, activist, social critic, and educator. Ruby Sales looks at her work as a calling, much more a calling than a career. She answered the call to social justice as a teenager at Tuskegee Institute, where she joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and worked on voter registration in Lowndes County, Alabama. Sales received her BA degree from Manhattanville College and attended graduate school at Princeton University. Sales received a Master's of Divinity degree from Episcopal Divinity School, where she was an Absalom Jones Scholar. After Divinity School, she founded and still directs a national nonprofit organization, the Spirit House Project. Ruby Sales is one of the founders of Sage Magazine, a scholarly journal on Black women. As a social critic, Sales has published works in several journals, newspapers, magazines, and is a frequent guest on Pacifica Radio and Blog Talk Radio. Ruby Sales has received numerous awards and honors, including being selected as one of 30 African Americans to be spotlighted in the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture here in Washington, D.C., which is scheduled to open, scheduled to open in early next year. And she lives and works in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, a little bit about tonight. We have a time of conversation where Dean Hall will be in conversation with Ms. Sales, and then we will have time for question and answers with the audience. And so, with no further ado, I welcome you both to this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I know that we have a large turnout this evening, both because of Ruby's association, not only her lifelong work, her association with Jonathan Daniels, but she preached in the summer at St. Albans, and I keep hearing from everybody how I really should have not been preaching myself that morning, but should have been over there listening to her. So, Ruby, it's great to have this conversation with you. We had dinner with Ruby and Cheryl last night, and which went late into the evening, talking about a lot of things that we're going to go over again today. And you'll discover that Ruby is an extremely thoughtful, not at all shy social critic. And so let me just start, Ruby, with this question. So put yourself back 50 years ago when you and Jonathan were in jail. Could you imagine the current state of affairs about race in America in 2015 from 1965? I mean, I guess my question is, what's better and what's not changed and what's worse?
Well, before I answer the question, let me just thank everyone for coming out, for being a part of this conversation, and for being in one of the biggest living rooms possible. I hope we'll have a very informal evening, and that something that we say tonight will touch something in you, and I'm sure you will touch me. Thank you so much for being here. To answer the question, I think that one has to look at the issue through simultaneous lens. On the one hand, of course, things have changed when you can use a public bathroom, where you can go to certain department stores and be treated like a human being. When Black students can go to certain universities without going 1,000 miles away from home because the white university won't admit them. Although voting rights is under siege, there are still many opportunities to vote in this country. That's one side of it. The other side of it is that there are more state-sanctioned murders today than there were lynchings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We are living in a society today where the public discourse, the language of hatred, runs as deeply today as it did during Southern apartheid, the system under which I grew up. We see xenophobia today as much as it existed then. We don't see the Dixiecrats today, but we see right-wing Republicans who believe, as the Dixiecrats did when I was a child, that America only belongs to white people. So we see that while things have changed, the racism is still rampant in this society. Racism not only against African Americans, but against brown people in this country. Anti-immigrant sentiments, the mythological lies that dehumanize brown people as much as black people in this country. So we are at an urgent period in American history, as urgent as the time was when Jonathan and I were in jail together, and the time in which he too was a victim of state-sanctioned murders.
Last August, the Episcopal Divinity School sponsored a pilgrimage to Hayneville and Lowndes County, Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma. And I told you last night that one of the things that really moved me in Hayneville when we moved from the square to the jail to the cash store to the courthouse was the extent to which you all had the full power of the state being used against you.
Yes.
So, and you talk a lot about state-sponsored violence and empires.
Yes.
So, tell me how your work involves that set of issues in terms of the legally and civilly sanctioned violence and oppression. How have you tried to engage that in your working life, and what do you think we should be doing as citizens, I guess, to change the will of the state?
Well, the first thing that we need to do as citizens is to tell the truth, to recognize that state-sanctioned murders in this country run very deep in the arteries of American society, that extends all the way back to enslavement, to the slave patrols. It is also important to be honest that state-sanctioned murders were a part of a racist southern region where police were used to hold African Americans in check and to maintain the prerogatives of a white supremacist region. We must come to grips with that. The question is not good or bad police. The question is that this kind of policing has been at the very heart of oppression of African Americans, brown people, and red people in this country. So when we get all bogged down into whether or not there's a good cop or a bad cop, we really evade the essential question, which is this system of policing that is an arm of a state, whether it's the empire, or southern states under the auspices of states' rights. So we've got to come to grip with this radical evil, this militarism that has been a part of American society ever since enslavement. And so what Spirit House does, we have been working on trying to shed light, trying to get a truthful conversation about the issue. We have documented more than 2,000 deaths of African American people by police 98% of them were unarmed since 2007, as young as 6 years old and as old as 97. This is the reality. So we are still living under issues that Jesus faced, who's pure and who's impure. White supremacy predicates itself on the purity of the white race and maintaining that purity. So it seems to me that as Christians who say that we follow Jesus, it is our obligation to really wrestle with the question of purity and who's pure and who's impure. And obviously, when we wrestle with that, we'll come to the conclusion that all of us are the same in the eyes of God, that there is no impure person. Straight, gay, black, white, young, old. We're all pure in the eyes of God.
That leads me to a question about, you are not only an activist, you're a theologian and a public theologian. So and last night we talked a little bit about Jesus and empire at the dinner table. I'm interested in your thoughts about what the faith dimension of this, of not only racism, but faith dimension of oppression, empire, and violence, and how your faith undergirds your work.
Well, I think faith, we tend to think of faith as being associated with a particular religion, but I think of faith as that deep impulse in us that makes us decide, in the face of spiritual adversity, in the face of physical adversity, in the face of material adversity, in the face of deep oppression, that in the words of the old black spiritual, I believe I'll run on and see what the end's going to be. It's the ability, it's the drive, it's the steadfastness. In the story of African Americans, generations of African Americans who tilled the soil of generations, who made the arid landscape of segregation fertile with hope, who inculcated within each generation the belief that the day of the Jubilee would come. And they did this because of their faith, when there was no evidence that their faith would ever bear fruit. But they kept on pruning and they kept on building. The same thing with the abolitionist movement. Few people who started out, who asserted that slavery was a radical evil and had a vision that they could turn upside down an empire that was predicated on enslavement. They sacrificed, they struggled, they believed when there was no evidence that any of that would bear fruit. That to me is faith.
And also, you could argue that Jesus's ministry was a critique of empire,
Yes.
and of a purity religion, right?
Yes.
And of a purity code that basically said you were holy. The purer you were, the holier you
Yes.
were. But that in fact, Jesus' critique is a critique of Rome and of imperial power that is
Yes.
essentially starving and oppressing people.
Yes. I think that what I would say the consistent theme that extends all the way back to Jesus is the question of disposability. Who's relevant, who's essential, and whom does the society see as disposable waste? We're living in a capitalist technocracy where only a few lives matter. And Black people, especially of all other people, are seen as disposable waste. So the question before us as a Christian church today in the 21st century is, what does it mean to be church in an age of disposability and in a culture of fear? What theologies should we be proclaiming? What should be our God talk in this age of disposability. It's not by accident that Black Lives Matter is the theme of African American people today. That's always been the theme of African Americans. That's not a new cry. It was the theme of African Americans, African people in the bowels of the slave ship. It was a theme of African Americans during enslavement when people said that we were properties, when the rulers of the empire declared that we were property. We asserted in the face of that declaration that Black Lives Matter. We sang in the face of enslavement, I've got a right, you've got a right, I've got a right to the tree of life. Black Lives Matter. During Southern Apartheid, our cry was Black Lives Matter. So when you hear that phrase, you must contextualize it as a long struggle of African Americans to assert our humanities and to ask white people to proclaim their humanities in a society where only white lives have mattered.
I heard someone say that the response, all lives matter, is always an act of aggression, because it's always said in response to the statement, Black Lives Matter, and that I've noticed just over the last few months how that all these people are trying to defang that phrase and make that phrase less specific and particular than it is.
The latest assertion is by the police, Blue Lives Matter. But I think that when people say all lives matter, it's a redundancy in terms of white lives, because white lives have always mattered. It's understood. But what needs to be asserted is that Black lives matter. And when people say that, whether they admit it or not, they're in opposition to the notion that Black lives matter. It's a resistance to that statement. And so I think what we have to really begin to be honest about, really honest about, that white supremacy means exactly that it is understood in the law, it's inculcated in the culture, it's in the public images, where it is made clear that white lives matter. Now, if a Native American person said all lives matter, that's a different kind of assertion, because Native lives have not mattered. If brown people say all lives matter, that's a different assertion. So we need to be clear about that. I'll stop and have some water.
Go ahead. I'll vamp till you're ready. In his sermon, Harvey Guthrie translated Hesed as passionate solidarity. And I'm thinking about the work you're doing as work, obviously, that all of us need to do together. So I'm interested, I want to ask you a little bit more specifically about Spirit House Project, but what's your sense of how we can build solidarity across the society and across the culture to really move this issue, move all these issues, anti-racism work forward?
One of the things that I think is very important, I've been thinking a lot about this, is the language that we use. The language that we use indicates where we think our place is in a conversation and what we claim. So I think in the 21st century, I want to move beyond the word solidarity, because the work that we must do is work that belongs to all of us. It's not just standing in solidarity with African Americans in terms of Black Lives Matter. It's not a Black problem. It's an American problem. It poses a clear and present danger to democracy. It tilts the nation towards fascism. It moves us closer to a police state. This is all of our work. So I would like for us to think deeply, and I haven't come up with the phrase, but what I thought about as I listened to the homily today, that one way that we might want to think about it is one with each other, standing one with each other. I would like for us to think of a language, a word, a phrase that makes it clear that we're not doing missionary work for Black people, that we are doing our work that is for all of our benefit. So if anyone is clever enough to think of a word, let me know.
There's that great chapter in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass where he talks about when he was moved from being a field hand to a household slave and the effect it had on the girl who owned him. And he said, slavery proved as injurious to her as it was to me,
Yes.
because it turned her into a different kind of person. And I
Yes.
think sometimes what we white people don't always understand is that racism is not only oppressive towards people of color, it's corrosive to white people as well. And so, in other words, you're right. This is a standing together. This is not one group of people doing something for someone else. This is a common work. But we seem to live in a culture where identifying the common good and working together for the common good is very difficult. So it is everybody's work, but I keep on finding myself stymied at times about how we just get all of us to come up under it together.
I think it's very hard to think about a common good in a society that predicates itself on being over and against, an anti-society. It's from the time, I've thought a lot about this, and I want to share this with you, because I have a lot of white friends who talk with me about fear. And I've been cogitating on that, because there was something about that implied that there was something to fear in Black people, that somehow we posed a danger. So I thought about that, and I think that when you are in a society where you are at the helm of oppression, and sometimes you've taken things that didn't belong to you, and you've held people down into small spaces, you must constantly watch your back. There's always the fear. You're always on the defensive to defend that which you think someone else wants. Racism breeds defensiveness. Inherent in that state of being is fear, because what also comes with it is the propaganda that people are very dangerous, that the world is a very dangerous place, that there's the enemy within and the enemy without. And you're constantly keeping your eyes open for enemies. And that's why security becomes a pervasive issue in the white psychic, where people are willing to give up rights, constitutional rights, to be secure. So what is this constant need, feeling that one's security is at stake? So I think that we've got to begin to look at these issues, and I think the irony of it, the supreme irony, is that racism, the empire, contains all of us. It keeps Black people and brown people in very small spaces, in very confined neighborhoods. It keeps white people in very small, confined spaces, in white neighborhoods. It presses all of us down to the lowest denominator in terms of our humanities and what it is we can possibly be. But I've been doing this work for a long time, and I say without any hesitation that this is not a time to despair, despite the rhetoric that we hear in the presidential debates, despite the murders that happen in schools throughout the country, this is a Kairos moment for each of us to step into history and put our unique patch on the quilt for an America that is yet to be born. And I feel very honored to still be alive, despite my bad knees, to be relevant, to be able to, before I cross over the riverside, to be able to put my little patch on the 21st century struggle quilt. So I say to each of you, don't get weary. Don't feel diminished because people say, let's tell the truth about ourselves. See that as an opportunity, not to cringe and be small, but the opportunity to stand tall and to be in the fullness of your humanity. And I think in a capitalist society, we're told that the ultimate expression of our humanities, of our personhoods, is what we own. But I suspect that many of us own a lot of things, but we're in spiritual distress. And I think that what I like about Christianity is that it opens the door for all of us. There's a place in it for all of us who are wounded and weary, who need a place to become bigger and larger in a society that presses us down into small spaces. And finally, I want to say about this great hope is that movement is not a place, it's a state of consciousness. It is not a place, it's not a good job, it's not entrance into a college, it's not the right to vote. It is first and foremost a higher state of consciousness where you reimagine the world, not the world that the empire has created, but the world that our most beloved God promises us, that each of us has the capacity to participate in bringing into being. And that is the good news, that there's a place around the welcome table for everyone to participate in this world that Isaiah talks about. So I think that's the good news, that we chain ourselves, but God gives us an open door.
One final question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So can you say a word about the work of Spirit House Project?
Yes. What we're doing at Spirit House is that we are documenting, systematically documenting the state-sanctioned murders of African American people. That's our latest project. And we will be issuing a very important report that will give the historical context for these murders and for understanding policing in this country and bringing us up to understanding that we live in a militarized police state where African Americans, with the war on drugs and the war on crime, we're no longer citizens, we're seen as enemies of the state. And so these are the issues that we will be dealing with. But at Spirit House, we have the Jonathan Daniels and Samuel Young internships, where we have interns who come and work with us from around the country. They've come from Spelman, they've come from Haverford, they've come from the University of Massachusetts, they've come from Florida State, they've come from Yale, they've come from all over the country to work with us. And we were in Washington for many, many years. And then I moved home to take care of my sick mother who died. And so we are now located in the South. And we expect to really be taking this message around the country and trying to touch people's hearts to get them to see that Black lives matter, and that the more we allow justice to take place and the injustice to take place in the street by police, that we are endangering this country that so many people invested in. I don't know about your relatives, but my father was in the Army. He fought in the Korean War. He fought in the World War II, and he fought to make the world safe for democracy. And he saw himself as a part of that vision. So too many hands have gone into making this nation for us to blow it.
Are there questions for Ruby?
I wanted to ask Ms. Sales,
Yes.
what direct memory do you have of the day that Jonathan Daniels was martyred in the cause that you worked with him together on?
First of all, the day started out very poorly and very scary. We were made to get out of jail, and there was nobody there to meet us, and we had not paid any fines, and that in itself was highly suspicious. The other thing that I remember about the day is that it was one of those hot southern days where the heat vibrates out of the cement, and we were hot, we were young, and we were tired and thirsty. And we went to the store, as young people were apt to do, to get sodas. And despite what we knew about terrorism, despite what we lived with Southern violence, we never thought that somebody would be waiting in the door with a shotgun, because we had gone to that store before. And we meant no one any harm. We just wanted a soda. And so that struck me about, our friends we were going to the store. And the other thing that struck me was getting to the door and realizing in retrospect how one's life can change with the blink of an eye. And feeling Jonathan pull me back from the back and falling down and hearing this mighty thud and thinking that I was dead. Seeing out of my eyes when I sort of began to be aware, Joyce Bailey calling me from a car as she having, Father Morris Rowe was running with her and dropped her hand when he was shot in the back. And what I remember most about that day is Jonathan's body lying there and Father Morris Rowe crying for water and Tom Coleman walking over to Father Morris Rowe's body, daring anyone to give him water. And Father Morris Rowe crying in that hot sun, water, water, water. The other thing that I remember is running in that town screaming, and nobody would open the doors for us. And the next thing I remember was the following day. We didn't know where Jonathan was. We didn't know where Richard was. And discovering that Jonathan was dead. I thought he was dead, but I wasn't sure. Because when Stokely and I and Silas Norman went back to the area, went back to Hayneville, there was no blood on the cement. Everything had been swept clean. And so there was no evidence that a murder had taken place that day. That's what I remember. And afterwards, what I remember most is at the trial, being so young but determined and walking up to the witness stand and being accosted by this white man who pulled a gun on me. A knife. And the other thing I remember is that I was so upset because they made us stand out in the rain. They would not let us go in the witness rooms. And the other thing was that they acted as if it were a picnic. Good old boys' day. There was no obvious remorse.
Next observation, question?
Yes, I have a question. I heard you say your father served in the war,
Yes.
and so did I. Due to the
Was that
course-
what war was that?
I was in the Korean War.
Okay, good.
I've served in Korean War
Yes.
myself. I have 2 Bronze Stars and combat infantry medals.
Yes.
And due to the course, we're, many of us in the facet of this world, black, brown, red,
Yes.
and we have a president now, is one of the smartest presidents I feel we ever had. And many times we've had governors in this state didn't even have a high school education, and some of the presidents didn't even have college education. And we don't have any respect for our president. And I'm looking at this, and all the warriors like myself and your father have served this country with good faith. What is going on? How can we change these things?
Well, I think that that's the question that I think that we should take home with us and ask, why are these things still going on? Why has this man who's a veteran of the Korean War, who served his country, why is he walking around being harassed, intimidated, and afraid to drive while black? I think that's the question that we must all entertain. Now, I know some people believe in the criminalization of African American people, that we are by nature criminals, that we are immoral people, that we pose a security threat to civilized society. I know that there are lots of propaganda that people use to justify the murders of African Americans. But I'm asking each of you as Christians to ask yourself, why is this still happening? And Christians are remaining silent.
Could you tell us a little about Jonathan Daniels?
Well, what can I tell you about Jonathan
Personal.
except,
Your relationship.
okay,
How
my
you doing?
relationship. I met Jonathan when he came to Lowndes County once with Stokely Carmichael. We went to Birmingham together. We became sort of traveling companions. I was young. Jonathan was older. He was a little bit more sophisticated. I was a little bit raw. And he liked teasing me. And we developed a real friendship. And what I can say about Jonathan is that while he had an extraordinary commitment to justice, he was also an ordinary young person. Dare I say, he liked to drive fast. He liked to do, we were young. And had a spirit, and we got angry. Both Jonathan and I have flash tempers. Jonathan has a flash temper, I have a flash temper. But it was that passion that drove our tempers that propelled us to be in Lowndes County, Alabama. Jonathan had twinkling eyes. His eyes twinkled. He had a wonderful smile.
What can community churches do in the South, white churches primarily, to help change what exists today? Or are all the white people bad people?
We're not talking about good or bad people. We're talking about systemic injustice that lays at the heart of an empire. If we get into who's good and who's bad, that's quicksand that we'll never get out of. It doesn't matter that he's a good person. Systemic injustice exists. So it's a larger question than the individual human being. It's the system. It's the system that we're trying to analyze. And I think that at the risk of going too far out here, which I will, I think that Southern churches must tell the truth. They must say what enslavement was. And when Southern churches participate in a historical lie that says that when they hang heroes, Confederate heroes, in churches, that they are celebrating a culture, then I must interrogate what culture is that? What history is that? It was a slave culture. It was a history of enslavement. So you're supporting people and holding people up whose very existence goes against what you proclaim to be the heart of Christianity. And so I'm asking people to be real, not to condemn each other, but to be brave enough to speak the truth, not to power, but to each other. That's the first place to begin. And if you speak the truth, it will become obvious as to what your next steps are. But as long as people persist in delusions and not being willing to tell the truth, that Southerners have indeed, I grew up in the South, celebrated a culture of enslavement, that the Civil War was fought. The Second Amendment was not about the right of all Americans to carry weapons. It was a new country, and it was a compromise between the North and South over the South's fear that they needed to have control slave insurrections. So the Second Amendment, contrary to what we're being told today, why would the founders give ordinary people the right to arm themselves against, carry arms in a nation that was just newly found? It was really about controlling enslavement. So from the very beginning of the Second Amendment, it was understood that only white men could carry guns. So we need to be clear and tell the truth about these things. And I think that it will free us from years of bad history and years of what I call nightmares.
More,
Thank you very much for your reflections, Ms. Sells. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to ask one. I think about you as your 17-year-old self. And, you know, now we are very aware of post-traumatic stress disorder and how people are affected by violence. And I'm interested in, what did you tell yourself about this situation? Because you experienced something that could have had a negative impact on you for the rest of your life. And yet you sit before us with a great deal of wisdom. And I mean, it's what is that? Because Black people have faced stress and violence. So what did you tell yourself at 17, and how has this worked out for you?
Well, I did have post-traumatic stress for obvious stress for a year when I shut down and I would not speak. I love to talk, and I know I was traumatized when I didn't say a word. And so I went through that kind of trauma. I also went through the trauma of not wanting to be in tight spaces, feeling the need not to be contained in very small spaces. But it was not what I said to myself. It's what the voices, the ancestors, my parents, the voices that they said to me. The one thing I knew, that I could not hate. I knew that my response was not to hate Tom Coleman, because I grew up in a society where if we said we hated someone, our parents would have a fit. So I knew that was not an option. That was spiritually not an option for me. The other thing that I heard were the songs that I had grown up with. Those songs got me through. And one of the other things that got me through is that I really did believe that the work that Jonathan and I were doing in Lowndes County would bear fruit and was bearing fruit. So there are moments where I was despondent. There were moments when people wanted me to feel as if I should feel guilt about Jonathan's being murdered. And I had to say to people, I didn't kill Jonathan. Tom Coleman did. Of course, I'm grateful. I'm absolutely grateful to be alive. But I cannot live in that moment 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, or I would be paralyzed and bitter. So my challenge was how to celebrate and remember the past while claiming the present and the future. And that's how I made it, to not to be bogged down, but to use that as an inspiration to keep on loving, you know, one of the things you can either, when you go through something like that, you can either have a hard heart or your heart can be tenderized. And I chose to have a tender heart. And I think that's how I got through.
Wow. One more question, and then we'll have a reception.
Thank you for sharing with us tonight. You've used the term empire several times.
Yes.
Could you describe that and what that means to you?
By empire, I mean a government, an imperial government. By imperial government, I mean an imperialistic government whose arms extend not only throughout our country, but across the world, who rules with the iron fist of oppression.
Before we break, I understand from Ruth that somebody has something they'd like to present to Ruby.
While you're coming, the other thing that gets me through is a song that says that we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black mothers' sons is as important as the killing of white mothers' sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And the other thing is that you might kill the activist, you might try to kill the dream, but the impulse for freedom that lurks in all of us never dies.
Hear, hear.